So here we are at the Horses on Rails website. It's up at github.stungai-rrc/horses on rails, and we want to clone this repository. We're going to do so with this clone button. The first thing, though, I want to mention is an interesting feature of GitHub, which is that for a variety of different languages and frameworks, GitHub will actively monitor your repositories for security vulnerabilities. So you can see here, it says, we found potential security vulnerabilities in your dependencies. And this happens anytime you're working in like an open source ecosystem. So if you have a Rails project or a JavaScript project, it'll look at, for Rails, it'll look at the gem file. For JavaScript, it'll look at the package JSON. And anytime a known security vulnerability is in one of those packages, it'll alert you to that. And it can even do really cool stuff, as in it will automatically create pull requests to fix your problems. So there's a little bot called Dependabot, and it will tell me to bump up the versions on my dependencies because there's security vulnerabilities in the versions that I'm currently using. So it's not a big deal for us because we're just deploying this to our own personal machines, but it's a handy feature of GitHub. And I thought I would mention it because it's highlighted right here that there's security vulnerabilities in this repo. So they won't affect us because we're not going to deploy this. And probably later on this week, I'll go through and I'll start pulling in those pull requests that are auto-generated by the Dependabot. What we want to do is we want to go to this clone. You want to switch over to HTTPS because you are not a contributor to this repository. You just want to clone it. So you want to grab the HTTPS URL. I'm going to grab the SSH one because I am the owner of this repository. And then from a terminal, we want to do a git clone and then paste in your case, it'll be the HTTPS, and mine is the SSH. I'm just going to run that in the terminal, so it's going to be a git clone. And then I don't want to do it just in my root folder, though. I want to specifically first navigate to where I put my Rails apps. So once I've navigated there, now I'm going to do my git clone. And I already have a folder called Horses on Rails, so I'm just going to call it Horses 2020. You don't have to add that extra argument. If you just do git clone and then your HTTPS, it'll put it into an automatic folder called Horses on Rails. And then I can navigate to that folder. So there's a few things that we're going to want to do here. One of them is we're going to want to add that folder to VS Code. So I'm going to navigate to where I just cloned that repository. I'm going to find it in my list. There it is. And I'm going to say OK. And then within that repository, if you are running a different version of Ruby compared to me, then there's a few files that you'll want to deal with. Ruby, because Ruby versions change over time and because there can be deprecating changes, Rails tries to make it so that if you were to sort of try to revive a repository months later, years later, and try to get it running, there are a few things put in place to ensure that it'll run in the same way as it did when you first created it in the past. One of those is the gem file and the gem file lock, which sort of locks all of your gem file dependencies to the versions that you were using when you created this application, so that if you try to revive this application at a later date, you'll revive it at the same versions of all of the different dependencies. And the other is the Ruby version. And so just to simplify things, this repository was created with Ruby 2.6.3. We could change that to match our repository, or our version of Ruby, or we can just delete that file. And then the other place that we need to go is into the gem file. The Ruby version's mentioned there as well. We can just remove that line, or again, update it to match our version of Ruby. We're now going to run bundle install. If you get an error that your version of bundler doesn't match the version that this system was bundled with, you will have to delete your gem file lock, which is something that you don't often want to do because, again, that file exists to lock you to all the specific versions of gems that existed when we first created this application. But it's actually okay in this instance to remove that because we're not too far away in terms of version numbers from the versions that are actually specified in this gem file. Whenever you're dealing with any set of dependencies, these days, whether it's in the Rails ecosystem or the JavaScript ecosystem, a lot of the projects out there follow what's called semver or semantic versioning. And that's just sort of like the idea of having 3 different numbers associated with your version, where each of the 3 numbers has a specific semantic meaning. The rightmost number is like the patch release. So for like small fixes and security updates, that's the number that's going to change. And if the project is following semver, it should never break anything to upgrade to a new patch release, right? That should just be a drop-in replacement, no breaking changes. It's a security fix, it's a patch. The next step over is like the minor release. This is when new additions are being pushed into the system, and you might also get deprecation notices here, where they're going to be told like something is changing in the future that is going to be a breaking change, and there's warnings that may start popping up. And then the major number here, that's for major versions, and that can include breaking changes, and sort of all bets are off if you upgrade to a major version in terms of your application might need fixes in place to work with that new version. So we're not too far off in terms of Rails. This was created with Rails 6.0.0. Our version of Rails is not too far away. So we're going to run bundle install. If that fails on you, then try deleting the gem file.lock and running bundle install again. So that goes and it fetches a bunch of dependencies for me. All of the standard Rails ones. After running, the next step was we navigated to our folder, and then after that, we do a bundle install. After the bundle install is successful, we're going to do a yarn install. So that'll grab all the JavaScript dependencies. Then we need to set up our database. So we're going to do a Rails DB migrate. Then we want to populate our database. So we're going to do a Rails DB seed. But before doing that, I also, and maybe we should have done it before the bundle install, but it'll be okay. What I also want to do is this repository is sort of done. This is a previous version of this project. I want to take us back in time to a time when the repository wasn't done. So maybe even after the bundle install, we'll do that. We may need to run bundle install again, but it shouldn't be a big deal. What we want to do is we want to do a get checkout to create a new branch. And specifically, we're going to call that branch like back in time. If we just did get checkout -b back in time, that would branch off of whatever branch we're currently in, which would be master. But what we specifically want to do is we don't just want to branch off of master, we want to branch off a version of master from the past. And so if I go look at my repository here, I can look at the commits. There's a very specific commit that I want to start with, which is this one right here. I sort of know where I want to get to in this repository, and it's this commit right here before I started messing with the schema. Every commit in Git is identified with a particular hash, so it has a unique identifier. And you could see beside each one of these commit messages is a hex number. If I click in on that particular commit, you can see that's the full hex number right here. It's a big, long hex number that it uniquely identifies or fingerprints this commit. In most repositories, I mean, we could check out and we could specify that entire large number, but we don't actually need the whole thing, because in any given repository, you probably only need like the first 7 digits or so, and that would be like unique enough to identify that particular commit. And so if we look here, when they give us the numbers just in the list of commits, those, they only show us the first 7 digits, or 6, what is it? 3, yeah, 7. And so if I go through here and I just grab those first 7, copy them, that's what I want to check out. So I'm just going to pause the video here so it can do what it needs. Oh no, it's done. Okay, so even if yours is not done, I'll give you all some time to catch up on this. But yeah, the next step here is I'll do a git status. I'll do a git add and a git commit to get these changes into place. So install after moving version. And then I'm going to go and do this line here, git checkout -b back in time, and then that particular version. After we do that, we're going to have to run bundle install again, because we're going back in time. It'll run way faster because we just went and got all the gems, so they'll already be in our system. Then we'll run yarn install, then we'll do the migrate, and then we'll do the seed. So I'll pause until we're done all of that. So we've run all of these commands, which should mean that we can do a Rails S at this point to fire up the server. We can also do a little bit of an exploration. Oh yeah, the other thing we need to do is I didn't go and remove in this one. Oh, I did. Okay, so there's no Ruby version file here, but the gem file needed to change. Okay, so I just needed to make sure that I still had deleted that Ruby version and that my gem file didn't include the Ruby version, because I initially made those changes over on master. And if we poke around this repository, there's a few places where I like to visit a Rails repository for the first time to get sort of a general sense of what this repo has to offer. The first place is in the DB folder. There is a schema file, which is a Ruby description of the database. So this will give us an idea of what we've got in this database. We've got 2 tables, a breeds table, where a breed simply has a name. That's the only sort of special property for the breeds. And then horses, well, horses have names, and they are also associated with a particular breed. And so a horse has a breed ID, which is a foreign key. So that gives us a sense of the database that's sort of under the hood here. If we go to the app models folder, we should see a model for each of those things. A breed, which has many horses, a horse, which belongs to a breed, and the next place I tend to look after the schema and the models is the routing system, because that gives us an idea of sort of the surface area of the URLs that are present in this application. So if I look at the routes, we can see that we have a root route. So when we just go to just /localhost 3000, that's going to go to, it looks like a breeds controllers index action. and then we're using the resources command, but we're only asking for one of the RESTful resources for each of the breeds or the horses. We just want the show page. So that's the member route that displays an individual, either breed or horse by ID. So for this one, it's going to be like /breeds/SomeID, and for this one, it'll be /horses/SomeID. And if we go to the controllers, we can see those. So we're expecting in breeds for there to be a show action and an index action, and for horses, there will only be a show. And so there's breeds. We're listing all the breeds, or at least loading them all up ordered by name. And when we show a breed, we just find it by ID. And then for horses, we just simply find a horse by ID. So if we go over to the application itself, we should see that happening. Go to localhost. We give it a second to do its various Rails caching stuff. There's the first time we visit localhost, it takes a little bit of time, and then after that, we don't take up as much time. So we have this overarching link at the top that just goes back to this homepage. Here's the breeds that have been instantiated in my database, at least, and then for each one of those breeds, there is a certain number of horses. So this is the index view of breeds. It's showing all of them. This is the show view of breeds. It's showing all the associated horses. And then for any given horse, I can click in to a page which right now just shows the horse's name. So there's one fix that I know that needs to be made, and it's just there was a bug in this application. It's a minor bug that's in the layout file for the views. If I view source here, we can see that this H3 here is red, and that's because the H2 above it never closes. So I've got a little bit of invalid HTML just because I forgot to close the H2 here. So we're going to fix that up before we do anything else. That's in the app views layouts folder, application layout. That's right here. At the end of this line here, right before we yield in each individual view, I just need to close that H2. So that's a small little fix. If I reload, that is no longer red and the H2 is now closed. Visually, nothing will change on the website. It's just a little fix that needed to go into place. I will open up another terminal here and just add that fix into place because it'll show up as a present. So I'll add that and commit it. Closed the unclosed H2 in the application layout. So the next thing I want to do is I want to show you how to add new properties to database tables or models that already exist. Because up to this point in the course, we've been sort of fully creating our model, assuming that we know all of the properties that that thing already has. Here we saw that in our database, we had a horse which only has a name. I want to add some more properties because I want to eventually pull in a styling framework. We're going to use Bulma, the CSS framework, to style these horses as little cards, but I want there to be a little bit more to a horse beyond its name. And so what we're going to do is we're going to use migrations. So when we first sort of created both a breed and a horse, we did so with a Rails generate model, and that made a migration for us. If we look in the migrate folder, we would see the migrations that did those things, the create horse and the create breeds. So one way to make a change here would be to go in and just like add to this migration. We can see here we're creating a string. We could add other rows here, and then we could delete the SQL database, and we could run Rails DB migrate again, That's not the proper way though, because the whole point of migrations is to capture incrementally over time the changes that are being made to your database so that those changes can be shared across the team. And so we're gonna, at the command line, do a Rails generate migration. And I'm gonna do something. I'm gonna ask you not to hit enter because I'm gonna undo what I'm about to do. But I'm just gonna generate a blank migration and just to show you what that is. So don't hit enter there. We'll fix that up in a moment. So if I do a Rails generate migration, I just give it a name. Into my migrate folder, a new blank migration is going to be placed. Need to like refresh that or something. Well, I can just click through it here. Yeah, there it is. And it's just a blank migration. In this change file, I could put in any number of changes, and I could just go to the Rails guide on migrations and sort of say like, well, how do I make like a change that maybe alters the name of a column or adds a column or removes a column? I could put them all in here, and that would be fine. So that's one way of doing it. I'm going to delete that one and show you another way. If I do Rails generate migration, I can name the migration in a very specific way, and Rails will pick up the fact that I want to do some additions. So the sort of the style of how I name my migration is add X to Y, and then I specify what X is, and then I give it a type. And so Y here is going to be horses. I want to add to the horses table. What do I want to add? I want to add a column. That's going to be the X. And so we're going to start by giving a horse an age. And then specifically, I'm going to call out that age as a particular type. And in our case, this will be an integer. And this pattern, it can be written in either camel case or in snake case. So I could have it all lowercase, and it could be like add age to horses, or it could be in camel case. Either way, as long as I repeat the thing that I'm adding after the fact and give it a data type. So when I run this, Rails will pick up the fact that I want to modify horses. I want to modify it by adding an age, and that age is an integer. So I can hit enter here. It generates a migration for me. It's a very simple migration. I could have written this myself, right? But again, when there is a shortcut, I tend to learn those shortcuts and make use of them. So I'm going to do this a few times. I'm going to go back to my command prompt, and I'm going to add like a top speed to horses, and I'm going to make that top speed a decimal number. And again, I could have stacked each one of these into a single migration, but I'm just putting them into multiple migrations so that each migration describes one atomic change to the database. And so that created for me another migration, which is just an add column to horses, top speed decimal. And then finally, because we are dealing with horses in the future, where genetic modification of horses for racing purposes has run rampant, we have a number of legs that horses have, and it is a whole number of integer. And then if I look at that file, looks the same as the others. They're all add column statements. Each one of them generated by a Rails G migration, and then naming the migration in that add X to Y pattern, and then specifying the data type of what is being added. Top speed was a decimal. You got it. Yeah, top speed decimal type. Just for a little variety. And then recall that these migrations themselves, they don't actually make the change to the database until we run them. And so I need to do a Rails DB migrate to actually run any outstanding migrations. So Rails will pick up the fact that there's 3 migrations that haven't yet been executed, and it will execute all 3 of them, adding the age, top speed, and the number of legs to my horses. And if we now go back to that schema file that we looked at earlier, so I can do a Control P and I can say DB schema or ski. That'll use the fuzzy finder to open up my database schema. And now we can see that our horse table is larger than it was before. The neat thing about Rails is because we have this schema file, there are gems that will draw ERD diagrams for you from your schema. So you just put the gem in, and that's another way when you're coming to a Rails application for the first time, you're like, oh, what does this database look like? Well, it can be sort of helpful to look at the schema, but then you have to sort of untangle all the foreign key references. If you put in the gem, the one I used in the past was called Rails Roadie, but I know there's a few others. It'll just generate PNG, which is the ERD for your schema. So, for example, when you're starting up your project, one of the things I asked for is to provide me with an ERD. Well, you can go out and build all of your database using migrations, and then you can just generate your ERD using that gem if you choose. You can do it the other way around as well if you want. So those things have been added. That's great. I now want to go to. I wonder why Git's not picking up any of the changes here. That's a little weird. I'll just do my Git work at the command line. Oh, there. You're lagged for some reason, VS Code. Added new properties to horses. And I'm open up the seeds file, my DB seeds file, because right now we are creating 5 breeds. We're using Faker. Faker's already plugged into this app in the gem file. We create unique fake horse breeds, and then we create horses by name. We now want to add some other things to those horses. Specifically, I'm going to add an age. I'm just going to use Ruby's random number generator or pseudo random number generator here instead of Faker. So I'll just say a random number. These horses, they start racing at age 3, and they can race right up until their 348th birthday. I need some commas in here to make this valid. That's a comma. That's a comma. Their number of legs. And so here we have anywhere from like the 1-legged hopping horse right up to the 27-legged ultra horse. And then we have the top speed. And here I'll just generate some kind of weirdo number based on pi, 3.1415926 times a random number from, I don't know, 20 to 56. So a few bits of randomness in there so that we can have horses that have different ages and different numbers of legs and different top speeds, so that we have something to display about these horses when we display them. I'm thinking now it might have been nice to have even more information, but we'll go with this for now at least. This is fine. At the top of the seed script, we destroy all the horses and all the breeds, and so we should now be able to run this seed script at the command line with a Rails DB seed. It will delete all the existing breeds and horses and then recreate them, and now the horses that it creates will have those extra properties in place. So I still created 5 breeds. I still created 75 horses, which makes sense because that's 15 horses per breed across 5 breeds. And even if I went back to the application, we wouldn't see the name or the age or the number of legs yet because that's not in the view yet. One of the things we do know is that horses are displayed in 2 places. They're displayed when we go to the individual breed page. It shows horses by name. And also when we click on a particular horse, it shows a horse there. What I would like is I would like to have a nice little card to display this horse information, and I want on the breeds page a nice collection of cards, and then on the individual page just a single card. And what I mean by card is we're going to use the Bulma framework, which is a CSS framework similar to Bootstrap. There's a bunch of these out there. I encourage you to experiment with some of them during the term. I imagine many of you have already used Bootstrap before, so you might want to use something like Bulma or Semantic UI or Materialize. There's a whole bunch of them out there. They all have different looks and feels and pros and cons. I really like Bulma. It has a whole bunch of like built-in components that I can make use of, one of which is a card. It also has a very nice grid system that's based on Flexbox. So we're going to use a card similar to maybe this one right here, where there's some text up top and then some separation down below. And it's down below that we'll put like the age and the top speed and things like that. The other thing is that we want this to be displayed in 2 places, right? We want the horse information to be displayed on the horse show page, but also on the breed show page. And we don't want to have to repeat ourselves. We don't want to have to style out the horse in one place and then replicate those styles again in another place. If you've worked with a JavaScript UI framework, you know all about components, which are a way of defining the HTML structure of a thing that can then be replicated in many places. And Rails has something similar to components, which it calls partials. So we're going to create a partial for a horse that we can use in multiple places. On this page, we're going to render that component or the partial for the horse over and over and over, once for each of the horses. But on the individual horse pages, we'll render it just once. So we're going to do that by going to the Views Horses folder, and I'm going to create a new file here. And I'm going to name this file underscore, which is what all partials start with, which differentiates them from other regular views. And then I'm going to name it after what I am going to associate with this partial. This is a partial specifically for something that comes from our horse model, and then .html.erb is our standard view extensions. And you can sort of think of these partials almost like functions for HTML. So we're taking some replication out of potentially 2 locations in our code, and we're going to be able to pass in some data into this partial. We're going to pass in an object of type horse, and we're going to be able to access that object with a horse variable. So for example, we could, if I just put a paragraph tag in here, output the horse's name by just going to horse.name. So a very simple partial that's just going to take the horse object that's being passed into this partial and display its name using an ERB echo inside of a paragraph tag. And then I can make use of this partial in the two places where I said we wanted to, one of them being in the breed show page to display a bunch of horses, and then one of them being in the horse show page to display a single horse. So I'm going to go into here, show. I'm going to remove what was in there initially, just noting the fact that we have an @horse variable. That's where the horse being displayed is currently being stored, is in that @horse variable. Where's that coming from? Well, that's coming from our horse controller, right? That's this thing right here. So the show loads up that @horse variable. So I'm going to delete that line there. And then here, I'm just going to say render. And I'm going to render that horse variable. And again, a little bit of Rails magic here. Because of conventions and because we followed them, what Rails is going to do, it's going to look at this object and say, okay, that's an object of type horse. In the horses view folder, is there a horse partial named horse? And there is. And so it'll then take this variable and it'll hand it off to that horse partial and make it known as horse instead of @horse. And so if I go to this show page here for an individual horse, there is the horse name. And if we look inside of it, it's being displayed inside of a paragraph tag like we asked for. We also want our horses to be displayed on this breeds page. Right now, we are displaying the horses by going to the breed, going to its associated horse collection, looping over them and sort of dropping down links to each horse page. Instead of having to do that, again, I can rely on Rails conventions and just say render horses. And again, the magic kicks in and Rails says, you've got a collection. What's that collection full of? It'll look inside. It'll see that the collection has horse objects, model objects of type horse. It'll then look in the view horses folder, see if there is a horse partial. There is, and it'll render it over and over, one for each horse in this collection. And so if I go back to this view file, what is it not like? Nil is not, oh yeah, it's not horses. It's breed.horses, right? Because that's what we have inside of this page. We have a particular breed. It's the breed's horses collection that we want to get to. So I was able to see that here because I noticed it was nil. It's saying nil is not an active model compatible object. No, it's breed horses that I actually want. And there they are, all of the horses, one paragraph after the other being displayed. Now they're not links, so I can just go in and make them links. So I go to my partial. Initially, it'll be a little bit awkward because there'll be links on the page that they actually link to. So it'll have a link where we're already at that page, but we'll fix that later on. So here we are. We've got a link to. It's going to use the name of the horse, and it's going to link to that horse inside of the partial, so that when we reload this page, all of our links come back. When we click in, we're there. And then this is the awkwardness, is like it's still a link, but it's just a link to this page that we're already on. So we'll put an if statement in later where we can see, like, do we want the link or not? But for now, we'll just keep it sort of consistent across the two. So again, here's what my partial looks like. Currently just a paragraph tag echoing out a link. And then when I'm using it on the breeds page, I'm rendering breed horses, so rendering the collection. And when I'm using it on the show page, I'm just rendering that horse variable. Yes, I can. So there's the partial. Does anyone have any questions or confusions or things that aren't working on your machines at this point? Here, we're going to bring in, first I'll add this in here saying like added a simple horse partial. So now I want to show a little bit about how we might bring styling into a Rails application, and I'm going to do it in, there's a bunch of different ways that you can bring in CSS into a Rails application. Simplest way, or one of the easiest ways, is in your app assets folder. Any style sheet you put in the style sheets folder is just automatically loaded. So you could download various frameworks and just drop them into that style sheets folder, and that would work. There's also sometimes gems that are set up that you can add to your project. So for example, there's the Bootstrap gem. When you add the Bootstrap gem, it automatically adds Bootstrap to your application. I'm not sure if there's one for Bulma. There could be. What we're going to do is an even simpler fix, which is if we go to bulma.io, so that's bulma.io, and we go to the documentation and the overview and the start. There is a single file that we can drop into our layout to get Bulma in place. And so that is, if you go down to the starter template, you will see a link tag. We're just going to copy that and one other tag. So I'm going to go to my application layout. That's in my app views layouts folder. And below where I have my style sheet and JavaScript tags that Rails is provisioning, I'm just going to drop in what I copied and pasted from that layout, which is just going to load Bulma up from a CDN, a content delivery network. And so it's going to load up the latest version of Bulma. To get newer versions, I would just have to update that URL. It's sort of a very simple way to get a framework into your application. Bulma is what's called a responsive framework, and so for responsiveness to work well on mobile devices, we also have to add a meta tag to our head to make it so that on mobile devices, the device doesn't just try to show the whole desktop app like zoomed out. Sometimes when you are on your phone and you go to a website, it looks like a very zoomed out tiny version of a desktop app, and you have to sort of scroll with your pinch zoom in with your fingers to see it. That's because they don't have this meta tag that we're about to add. So this is the responsive viewport meta tag that always has to be present when we have a responsive layout. And it's just a way of hinting to the browser that the width should be set to the device width and that the initial scale is 1. It can also be used, there's a modifier in here, we could prevent zooming. You could like not only set the initial scale to 1, but fix the scale at 1. And you'll sometimes see that you'll get to a mobile website where like the pinch zoom just doesn't work. And that's because they've used the viewport to restrict it. But we're just going to set it up so that the width is the device width and the initial scale is 1. And that will make it so that the responsiveness works well, that this thing will work on mobile devices. If we go back to our actual application, we're going to notice that the styles that are present in this app, the sort of the default styling that web browsers give to things, is going to be stripped away. The font is going to switch over from a serif font, serif where you have the little hangy pieces off of your characters, to a sans serif font, and the styling of things like headers and whatnot is going to sort of disappear. So if I reload this, looks like that. Everything has the same font size, including H1s and H2s. And everything has now lost sort of the default margins. I'm up in the top sort of left corner here. And what I want to do is I want to go back to that little template, and I'm going to grab 2 tags here. I actually know what they are. I'm just going to type them in. One of them is that Bulma assumes that everything is going to be wrapped in a section with a class of section. So I'll put the end section over here. And then it further assumes that we're going to have a div with a class of container. And that div is going to be closed up here. And then I can just poke these things in a little bit as well. So a section with a class of section and a div with a class of container. Both of those are going to add different amounts of sort of margins and padding in place and make it responsive so that there'll be specific breakpoints where sort of the default width of the stuff that's on the screen is going to change based on the size of the viewport being used. And then within there, I've still got my H1, my H2, and the yield, which is my individual views. Like that. Got the margins and padding back in place. That's lovely. We lost the styling on the H1 and the H2. This is because by default, Bulma sort of like strips everything down to sort of one common look and feel, and then you build your styles back up again by adding classes. So this is also the thing that was sort of like the Bootstrap way. We style our pages not so much by writing CSS, but applying specific styles to elements in the pattern that the framework dictates. And so for Bulma, that means that we can go here and look at elements and specifically title to see how we style titles. And we do so with, we have two different classes, the title class and the subtitle class. Those can be applied to anything. So they could be applied to headers, but they could also be applied to like paragraph tags or whatnot to get the same result. And then Bulma operates on this idea of classes and then other classes that are like modifiers. So title and subtitle are two classes, but then you can get different sizes of titles by adding like is1 or is2 or is3 beside those things. And so I'm going to go here, the H1, and I'm going to give it a class of title, and I'm going to say is1 to get sort of the biggest of the titles. And then here I'm going to say class subtitle is maybe I'll pick a 4. We'll see what it looks like. And if I go back to my application just to see what those look like, there's my horses on rails and there's the subtitle associated with it. If I go just to the home page, there are a few other places where I might like to drop back in some styles. One of them is this thing here. So I'm going to leave my application layout behind after giving it the title and the subtitle on the H1 and the H2. I'm going to go to the index for the breed. There's an H3 in there, and so I will give it a class of title. I'll say it is a 3. Like so. Seems a little too big for me. I'll say is a 4. Yeah. The one thing I miss when I'm operating in Bulma that I get in Bootstrap are little helper classes to push things around. So Bootstrap gives me little tiny modifiers that can add margins above or below or left or right. We don't have those in Bulma, and so if I want to separate out this from this, which I do, I need to write some CSS myself. But that's a good opportunity to show you where we can add our own CSS in a Rails framework. So I'm going to do two things. I'm going to go back to my application layout, and I'm going to wrap the H1 and the H2 in a header tag so that I have something to modify. And then that. So let's see if there's any default styling on that header tag, or if, yeah, I get even less of a margin now. That's okay. So here's my header. It's wrapping my H1 and my H2. Where I can go put my own custom CSS or SCSS, if you're so inclined, is in my app asset style sheets folder. This isn't really anything that has to do specifically with breeds or horses, so I'm just going to create a new file in here, and I'm just going to call it styles.scss. We can put plain old CSS in here, but it'll also support Sass, which is a sort of a variant of CSS that compiles down to regular CSS. We'll talk about that in more depth later on in this course. For now, we're just going to go to the header, and we're going to say margin bottom to rem, and I need to spell margin correctly. That's crucial. I was telling the other class that I'd started to see people using rem instead of m when I peek at people's CSS, and I didn't really know the difference, and so a student came to me after class and told me that the difference between rem versus m is that when you use an m, it's like a multiplier of your parent. So if you're inside of a container that has a font size of 16, 2m is going to give you 32. And if it's a rem, it's a modifier of the body. And so rem is more consistent because it doesn't just depend on who your parent is. It's always just going to be a multiplier of that base body size that you have. And Bulma is going to be what sets up our base body font size. So with that in place, we have a nice little space out here. And so, yeah, any new CSS that we want to have custom CSS, not just Bulma class-based CSS, we can put in this file. At the command prompt, I can do a git add, and I can say added the Bulma CSS framework with some application layout styling. And then I want to just visit the other two show pages to give eventually. I don't need any styles there yet, but I'm going to give those styles eventually. So here in the show page, where this breed name is, I can say class title. This is in the app view breeds show page. So I'm going to say app title is 4 and a class of title is 5. We'll see how that looks. This gives us the ability to make the distinction between like the semantic meaning of the tags that we're using in our application and the styling of those tags. The semantic meaning of like an H1 versus an H2 or H3, that has meaning to bots like Google. So Google will look at an H1 and think that that's like an important distinction of like, this is what this page is about. This might be like the overarching like header thing, whereas an H2 will have slightly less prominence in terms of semantic meaning for the document. But then here you can see I'm not always pairing the same number of like the size meaning with the semantic meaning. So it gives me the ability to sort of separate those two things out a little bit. So if I click into an individual breed page, there is the name of the breed, and then the horses of the breed are displayed down below. So a little bit of styling. I now want to get into this idea of having some cards for my horses, and then we can really see the benefit of having that partial, because I will only have to implement that in one place and have the card displayed in multiple places, once here and once over here on the show page. So if I go to Bulma and I go to the component, specifically the component called card, I can see, let's see here, some of what I want. I'm going to go to my partial, Control P, and just search for underscore horse. And I want the one that's in my current project, which is here. So I've got a div with a class of card. I've got a div with a class of card content. And inside of that, I've got a paragraph with a class of title. Sometimes when you're working with these kind of frameworks, you can get heavily nested structures. They all suffer from a little bit of like divitis, in that you have lots and lots of divs that have no semantic meaning, that are only there for styling purposes. That used to bother me. It doesn't bother me anymore. I've gotten over it. What else do I want? I want a card footer in here. I can close up my card. Inside here, what else do I want? I'll output the breed of this horse. Horse.breed.name. And in a moment, we'll put in some information for the footer. I'll just leave this view for a second. I'll come right back to it. I just want to make sure things are looking okay here. Look, a pretty card. So there's like the card. It's got some drop shadow on it. There's the title of the card. There's the breed being displayed. That's happening because of the div with the class of card, the card content, and the card footer. If I go back over to Bulma, I want some sort of footer items like this. And so each one of those is a footer item, a class of card footer item. And so I can put in a paragraph tag with a class of card footer item. And then I can just like replicate those. Just go over here. Yeah, 3. And inside of each one of those, that's where I want to display my properties of my horses, like their age, their number of legs, their top speed. And so I can do that like this. I can say, well, maybe I'll do this. I'll say age, and I will echo out the horse. I always want to type hours sources. I don't know. Something's wrong with my muscle memory today. Horse.age. And then here, I will say legs. Oops. Legs. And that'll be horse.legs, or number of legs. And then lastly, speed. And have those be 3 card footer items that'll be displayed below the card content. Later on in this course, we might add like images to horses. So we might like put a card image in at the top of the image. We might add a description of the horse. We might put that in there as well. But for now, this is enough to get us to the point where we have something that looks like a card. Like that. Lacey is a 186-year-old horse with 10 legs and a top speed of 160 kilometers an hour. Let's put in kilometers an hour. There we are. Yes, let's do that. Let's do dot round to 2 decimals. That's better. You never know though, like in like the cutthroat business of futuristic horse racing, some of those decimal places might actually be important. But for now, we'll just say 2 is good enough. All right, so that's a horse on its own. Remember, we're also using this partial for the collection of horses on the breed page. And that's not going to look too great right now. We're going to have to do a little bit of an improvement there. The other thing we should do is maybe just make it so that I can get back to the breed page by linking to the breed. That's here. Breed should be a link to the horse breed. There we are. Let's change that up so that it didn't just display the breed name, but we used the link to, where the breed name was the link text and the horse breed was the target for the link. Now I can click on that. So, I mean, looks okay, but it's not really what I wanted. What I want for these cards is how we typically see cards laid out together is sort of in a column-based manner, right? Like if you think to this idea of cards, they were first popularized by like Pinboard, and then they sort of went everywhere on the internet. We sort of want a certain number of columns, and we want the horses to sort of be stacked within those columns. And so what I'm going to do is in Bulma, we have a column system. Which is a way of making columns. And the way we do that is we have a div with a class of columns, and then inside of it, we have individual column elements. And so over on my, not my horse show page, but on the breed show page, I want to wrap everything in a class of columns. And then I think there's like an is multiline modifier. If I don't put that in, it'll just keep putting more and more horses column after column beside each other. With multiline, it'll wrap them and do some fun flexboxy stuff so that as I sort of work on different devices, on a mobile device, we might only have a single column, but on a desktop device, we might have multiple columns. So we're saying we're wrapping our horses in columns, and then back to the horse partial, we're going to make it a column. So I will say class column. And you can see what I mean now about divitis, right? We're getting deeper and deeper here in terms of our nested structure, closing that final div at the bottom there. So I've wrapped the entire card in a column. And so that's lovely. Here's Bolt and Cash and Isabel. They're side by side. Maybe we could do a little bit better with how we're styling this information down here. Like maybe the words age and legs and speed are, maybe they're bolded, but nonetheless, they're, or maybe we always ensure that like the number comes down below. We won't get into the finicky details of the styling right now. You can see on most of these columns, we've got 4 to a column, but we don't have a number that's evenly divisible by 4. So because of Flexbox in the final column, we have 3, which is nice. If we still go to the individual horse pages, we've still got this overarching, one big column, which is nice as well. I think I should probably wrap it in columns just to make it more consistent. That's the horse show page. So even though it's just a single element, it's now an element of type column, which expects a class of columns as a parent. And that should fix this little bump out here. Yeah, that was bothering me, the alignment. So that was in my app views horses show. I wrapped the render in a columns there. Does anyone need to see any one of my views right now? The partial or the partial here. And I'll put all of this up onto whatchamacallit, GitHub. I still sometimes revert to BRs. I don't know if that's like the worst thing in the world, but there we are. That makes things look a little bit more consistent for me. Yeah. Yes. So the breeds show is right here, which has the columns and then the is multi-line modifier on that. Is dash multi-line. And if we didn't have that is multi-line, then things would not work as nicely. We just assumed that we were columns all in one long row. And then if I go over to Bulma and I just look at my typographic helpers. Do I have typographic helpers in Bulma? I do. Text weight. Yeah, I want like some medium bold text weight, please. And I want that on my horse, on my strongs. So I'm getting finicky here, but that's just sort of how I get when I work with styling. I guess I don't even need that to be a strong tag. I could just make that a paragraph tag. Oh, and now I'll get rid of my BR. Yay! And then paragraph tag with the class of as text weight semi bold. Let me just see what that's looking like. Ugh, yuck. Okay, let's not go there. I'm not going to get finicky right now because I'm just breaking things. Maybe it was me putting a paragraph inside of a paragraph that did that. Yes, but then I don't want my age to be bold. I just want the text to be bold. Maybe it should just be a span. Let's see what we got here. Sort of. But now the BR is not working. Okay, forget it. I'm not going to be Kyle finicky styling person right now, because that's not the point of today's lecture, is it? All right. And the nice thing we can see now is we do have built-in responsiveness. So if I do go to my dev tools with a Control-Shift-I, if you're in Chrome, the same thing will get you there. And I go to the little mobile responsive button, which is in the top right corner of the dev tools. Again, that's the same in both Chrome and Firefox. You can either pick from a list of devices and be like, well, I'm on an iPhone. It seems like their devices are a bit old in terms of numbers, but it gives you an idea of like on a device that is of a smaller screen size, things have collapsed to a single column, right? And I can also just sort of fold it in and out, right? So on a large desktop, we're going to have at most 4 columns. So there's sort of a maximum size, so that on really large screens, we don't go too huge and make people like turn their heads while they're looking at our web page. And then as the screen size decreases, you get to a break point where we go from 4 to 3 columns, from 3 to 1, and then 1 collapses down to a point, and then it's got a minimum size on it as well. So we can support screen sizes down to about 280, 300-ish, and then beyond that tiny size of a screen, it's not going to look as nice anymore. But there you go. That's really what I wanted to show today, which is sort of how easy it was to bring in a framework like Bulma, make the application look quite nice. Again, the problem with all these frameworks is like the issue with Bulma or with Bootstrap when it got really popular is when you used it, like it was very obvious that your website was like a Bootstrap-based website because it looked like all the others. Now with Bulma, you're going to look like all the other Bulma-based websites. But for prototyping specifically, it just gives you the ability to create sites that look nice without having to do any of the design yourself. I personally am not a designer. When I need really nice design, I work with a designer. And when I'm just prototyping stuff, I work with one of these frameworks because it makes me look a little better than if I was just doing my hand created CSS. So we're going to continue next class with this same application. We're going to continue with horses on rails. There's not much more that I want to show you here. There is the idea of maybe a little bit of interactivity from the user perspective, maybe the ability to add comments on horses. And beyond that, I'll just think if there's anything else that we really need to add beyond what we learned today, which was partials and styling. But if anything, we'll just do a little bit of interactivity, giving the user the ability to fill out a form, submit that form, and add to maybe a comments table for particular horses. The other thing that I was going to say is I do have a video that I made last term. It's not a video that I recorded in class. It's just one that I recorded over the weekend, and then I sent it to the class, and it has to do with pulling data into your intro project. Some students are going to be pulling data in from like an API. Other students wanted to know, like, how could I pull data in from like a web page, like building like a web scraper. So you have a web page that doesn't have an API, but you want to pull a bunch of data in from that. And so I made a little video that talks about JSON API consumption and web scraping. It's just under an hour long, and so if you're either having issues with the API consumption, you want to see how that might operate in a Rails context, or if you have a website that doesn't have an API but has structured data that you want to scrape from your API or from that website into your database, that would be a video. I'll post that up on Learn. And then the other thing that I will mention about the project is some students get confused about the fact that there's an API behind the scenes, and they wonder if that API has to be part of the entire thing. Like as the user's navigating around the page, is that API being hit? And the answer is no. What you want to do is to build a seed script that will hit that API a bunch of times, pull in a whole bunch of data to populate your database, similar to what we're doing with Faker right now, and then just have that as a bunch of static data and build your website around that. And so that could be done, again, with an API or with some web scraping. And if any of you picked the Star Wars API for your project, well, you get a little bit of a bonus because that's what I cover in this particular video. So it's a fairly simple API, though, and I try to show how you can navigate a few of the associations to pull in not just one bit of data, but to traverse some associations. All right, so that's all I got for you for today. Thank you very much for coming to class and listening to me talk about horses.